This webinar is part of a series on teachers in Africa organized jointly by the African Federation of Teaching Regulatory Authorities, or AFTRA, UNESCO's International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa, or IICBA, and the African 19 Hub of the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange Platform, or KIX. You may register to participate in other webinars in the series at the QR code or the link shown in the screen. If you would like to be notified of initiatives for teachers in Africa, including other webinars, interviews, publications, and online trainings, please consider joining our joint AFTRA-IICBA WhatsApp channel. You may also find useful range of resources on the website of UNESCO IICBA at www.iicba.unesco.org, and please do not hesitate to contact us at info.iicba@unesco.org.
I'd like to begin. Maybe we can begin the recording, Hanak, as well.
It's on, Miriam.
Okay, great. All right, so it's my pleasure to welcome everybody here today. My name is Marianne, and I am part of the GPE KIX Africa 19 Hub team at UNESCO IICBA. IICBA is the International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa. And it's my honor to welcome you to this third webinar as part of a Teachers Empowerment series that we've been hosting now for about 2 months. So this webinar is called Social Dialogues for Teachers, Amplifying the Voice of the Teacher to Inform and Achieve Quality Educational Reforms in Africa. We're talking specifically about Sub-Saharan Africa. And this webinar is being hosted by 3 entities. We are UNESCO IICBA. We are the GPE KIX project at UNESCO IICBA. We're part of the Global Partnership for Education and also managed by the IDRC of Canada, the International Development and Research Center. And we're also working in partnership with AFTRA, the Africa Federation of Teaching Regulatory Authorities. And I will say that as a trained teacher myself, this webinar topic really excites me because when I was teaching, and I think some of us also have teaching backgrounds too, it's the passion that brought us to this profession for many of us perhaps. I think that we can identify with this topic in a way. And even if we haven't been teachers, we still have been touched by teachers in our lives. And we know that teachers have a very crucial role in not only the education sector, of course, but way beyond that, to society, to families, to every aspect of our world. So this topic is really relevant. It's motivating. I think it's one that a lot of us can identify with. So today we'll discuss the rationale of this idea of social dialogues. What are they? Why do we need to have them? And what is the purpose of them? And how can they help to support and build up the teaching profession, teacher quality, teaching and learning, and achieving student learning outcomes in line with the new Education 2030 agenda, the African Union CISA, and also the ILO recommendations. And we'll be hearing from quite a few of these entities today. We're going to really talk about why teachers should be at the center of social and policy dialogue, and why teacher voice matters for education development. Let me stop there and turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Saliu Sall. He's our Senior Program Coordinator at UNESCO IICBA, and he'll be welcoming you officially and setting the stage for today. Over to you, Saliu. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I hope that you can hear me very well.
Yes, Saliu, please.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Distinguished guests, esteemed participants, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome to this third and final webinar, as Marianne was saying, in the AFTRA-IICBA KIX series on teachers empowerment. My name is Saliu Sall. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator of UNESCO IICBA, and it is an honor for me to stand in for the Director of UNESCO IICBA and extend a warm welcome to all of you. Today's topic, as Mariam said, social dialogues for teachers, amplifying the voice of the teacher to inform and achieve quality educational reforms in Africa, is of paramount importance. We are gathered here to engage in crucial conversations that will enhance the role of teachers in shaping and implementing educational reforms across the continent. Let us take a moment to reflect on why we are here today. We are all able to attend this webinar thanks mostly to the education we receive from teachers. As a matter of fact, it was the teacher who taught us to read, who taught us to write, who taught us to think and to question. Our education and careers owe much to the teachers who have impacted our lives. And as Mariam said, many of us have been teachers. So today, we are united by our commitment to supporting teachers. We care deeply about their well-being, about their voices, about their empowerment, their salaries, their training, and their careers, to name but a few. Because, as the saying goes, when teachers thrive, so do their students. However, teachers in sub-Saharan Africa face numerous challenges. They often lack access to professional development and quality pre-service education. They work mostly in large classrooms with high student-to-teacher ratios and confront the pressing issues of learning poverty. Many of them are burdened with administrative tasks and social challenges, often without adequate pay, without adequate support. Most critically, teachers are frequently excluded from policy-making discussions, despite their invaluable insights. Yet, they are unsung experts whose classroom experience can greatly inform educational policy and reforms. So, it is very essential that education policies include teachers' voices, concerns, and ideas. For its part, UNESCO IICBA is committed to addressing these challenges through several initiatives. For instance, on October the 4th, this coming October the 4th, in collaboration with various partners, we will co-organize an important event at the African Union to celebrate Teacher Day. This event will underscore the vital role of teachers and further our mission to advocate for their needs. Additionally, ladies and gentlemen, IICBA has released the first and second Africa Teacher Reports, which offer critical insights into the challenges and opportunities for teachers in Africa. These reports highlight our dedication to understanding and addressing educators' needs and guide our efforts in educational reform. Our technical work also includes a strong focus on mental health and psychosocial support for educators. We do recognize the importance of supporting teachers' mental health, which is a key component of educational quality. Our initiatives aim to provide the necessary tools and frameworks to enhance educators' mental health and resilience. Both IICBA and KIX, and especially KIX Hub 19, are dedicated to supporting countries in their educational improvement efforts. Our commitment to collaboration and assistance remains steadfast as we strive for impactful and sustainable educational reforms. Today, we will explore how countries like Zambia or Uganda are including teachers in policy and social dialogue and educational reforms. This exchange of best practices is facilitated by the Global Partnership for Education, Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, KIX Hub 19, which has been identifying evidence-based practices for improving educational policies in sub-Saharan Africa since its creation in 2020. As we embark on today's discussions, I encourage all participants to actively engage and share their valuable perspectives. Together, we can amplify the voice of the teacher and advance reforms that benefit students, educators, and the educational system as a whole. We hope that today's discussion will influence decision makers to establish platforms for teachers' policy and social dialogue. Thank you very much for attending this important discussion on behalf of UNESCO IICBA, of AFTRA, of KIX Hub 19. I look forward to a productive and insightful session. Thank you very much. Marianne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Saliu. Very well said. Thank you very much for sharing the inspiring comments and your enthusiasm for teachers. I want to recognize the presence of Mr. Carlos Vegas, the Chief of Section for Education and Development at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. We're very glad to have you here, Carlos. Thank you so much for gracing us with your attendance today. Colleagues, before we continue, I'd like us to turn on our cameras just for a moment to take a group photo. This is usually the best time to take a picture. Could we all turn on our cameras for a moment for a group picture before we start to get busy with the program? Turn on your cameras, please. Okay, just is it possible for attendees as well to turn on cameras, or you don't have that option?
No, they don't have the option.
I see, I see.
Because
No
it's
problem.
a webinar
Okay.
format. Yeah.
That's okay. We'll address that next time. I'll take at least one quick picture. Just give me one moment, please. Dr. Ebby and Mr. Filbert, are you able to turn on your cameras?
I'm looking for my camera. I'm looking for my camera.
Okay, Marianne, let's just go ahead.
We'll just take it. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think then that'll be fine. Okay, thank you so much, Saliu, for the remarks. We're going to continue with our program today, and I would like to invite our keynote speaker to come forward to tell us a bit about why we need to promote teachers' participation in social and policy dialogues and how we can empower teachers and engage them meaningfully in development in their own education sector. So Dr. Ebby Mobanga, Dr. Ebby Mobanga is the Deputy President of the Africa Federation of Teaching Regulatory Authorities, of AFTRA. So Dr. Ebby, if you're able to turn on your camera, if not, then you can just proceed. But please welcome our keynote speaker, everyone. Over to you, Ebby. Thank you.
Dr. Ebby, you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you very much, Marianne. Of course, I'm sure I'll be able to show my face shortly. My camera and my video are not showing, but thank you so much. I'm going to speak through a presentation which will be operated by Henok. I'm sure my presentation is over there. So let me request Henok to show the presentation so that I can be guided by the presentation from there. Henok, I can't see my presentation. I'm sure shortly the screen, oh yeah, there we are. Thank you very much. That is the title of my presentation, a National Framework on Social Dialogue for Teachers in Zambia. And that is the outline of the presentation. I'll give some introduction and background, components of the framework, strategic objectives, stakeholder engagements, lessons and gains from the framework, challenges, and the way forward. So it's a short presentation. We can proceed. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I'm giving that general introduction where we look at social dialogue, which I'm trying to shorten as SD, which is defined as all types of negotiation, consultation, exchange of information between representatives of government, employers or workers on issues of common interest. This is according to ILO. For sure, social dialogue has to do with a number of engagements between or among stakeholders, and those are just some of the ones that we can talk about. Negotiations are critical. Consulting one another is important. Exchange of information is important. And in this context, we are looking at how teachers can be involved in negotiations, consultations, and exchange of information with their employers. In this case, social dialogue can take the dimension of collective bargaining, policy reform discussions. It could be something to do with disciplinary issues or conflict resolution. Those are just some of the examples that social dialogue can be applied on in the teaching context. Next slide, please. We can go to the next slide. I'm taken aback. Next one, please. That one is done. Thank you very much. When we talk about Zambia, we are saying the education sector in Zambia traditionally lacked a robust platform or platforms for teachers to meaningfully participate in policy making. Yes, there have been certain ways of them to participate, but I think we cannot point to any robust platform where teachers were meaningfully involved in social dialogue discussions. And this project aimed to address this gap by institutionalizing social dialogue among teachers, government agencies, and other stakeholders. And with support from UNESCO through the CAP-ED program, the Ministry of Education, the Teaching Council of Zambia, and the Teaching Service Commission collaborated to ensure that the National Framework for Social Dialogue was developed for teachers in Zambia. So this project was highly and totally supported by UNESCO. And as a country and as Teaching Council of Zambia, even on behalf of AFTRA, we must be thankful for this support for having developed this particular framework. We can go to the next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? Thank you very much. Now, the background to the development of this particular framework can be pointed to those steps highlighted there, which started in 2019, when a technical committee was established to develop the National Framework on Social Dialogue. And the same year in August, preliminary desk review consultations with Ministry of Education, Teaching Service Commission, and Teaching Council of Zambia was actually held. The same year in September, stakeholder consultations through an inception meeting on the in-depth analysis of the status of social dialogue in Zambia was also held. I'm sure you can see that the year 2019 was characterized with these discussions to make sure that the framework was debated and also processes to develop it were put in place. The next year, which was 2020 in March, a situation analysis on the prevailing status of social dialogue was done by a consultant who was engaged by UNESCO. The same year in July 2020, sharing of the consultants' report, and exploring modalities for the National Framework on Social Dialogue for Teachers in Zambia was conducted. And in 2021, December, this report was validated with the involvement of two other institutions, UNZA, which stands for the University of Zambia, and the Ministry of Labor and Social Services. So these other institutions were brought on board when validating the report. And in December 2020, there was a launch of the framework by the Honorable Minister of Education. And in February 2023, we started the piloting and the rollout of the National Framework for Social Dialogue for Teachers in Zambia. And we targeted two districts, namely Kitwe and Livingstone. And these came from two provinces. Zambia has 10 provinces, but we went to 2 provinces to do the pilot. And during these engagements, we drew teachers, head teachers, and others from the education sector. It was very exciting to see how people would want social dialogue to be used as a tool of negotiation and resolving a lot of issues in the education sector. The feedback from the stakeholders during the pilot project was really, really impressive. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. The social dialogue looks like that. When you come across the National Framework on Social Dialogue for Teachers in Zambia, that is the way the front cover looks like. And it is titled as such. And it has 5 components, which are divided in chapters. Chapter 1 looks at the introduction and the background to social dialogue in Zambia, and it highlights some of the things that I've just talked about. Chapter 2 looks at social dialogue from the broader perspective and the national perspective. And then chapter 3 provides measures for providing social dialogue, objectives, strategies with matrices for actions and lead stakeholder institutions. And the Teaching Council of Zambia is one of the stakeholder institutions with the Ministry of Education, teacher unions, the Teaching Service Commission. Chapter 4 looks at coordination and financing with support, of course, from the Secretariat under UNESCO. Chapter 5, lastly, highlights the monitoring and evaluation part of the framework. So basically, this is what constitutes the framework. Next slide, please. Strategic objectives, very important. The objective or objectives of this framework are as follows. First of all, it is to institutionalize social dialogue for teachers in Zambia because we have never had this tool or this platform before. So the desire is to have social dialogue at institutional level, at school level, college level, ministry level, wherever teachers interact, most importantly at school level where teachers need to be involved. Then the second objective is to promote the involvement of teachers, key partners, and the public in decision-making. We can never develop meaningful policies around education without involving or including teachers in the process. And number 3, which is highlighted, to strengthen the linkages between social dialogue, policy formulation, professional development, and research education. This is very, we are going to have formulation, professional development, and research relations in education sector, which is the biggest in Zambia. You may wish to note that in Zambia, the public sector, I think, has more than 75% who are teachers. So the teaching industry or the education sector is the biggest employer in Zambia. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Maybe those are just some of the pictures highlighting some of the stakeholders that we have engaged before. If you check, this one is a combined team of stakeholders during the validation meeting on the left, and on the right, it is the ICE, which is the ICT Center of Excellence. This is at a teacher training college. There is one college that we have involved to participate in social dialogue, especially when it comes to digitalization of social dialogue. So those are some of the people that actually participated. So these are just highlights of how stakeholders were engaged. Next slide, please. Thank you. Having done what we have done, I think there are a lot of gains that we can share, which seem to be working well for Zambia, which I think would be very important to share. So far, we have developed a step-by-step manual or guide for teacher unions and teachers on how to undertake social dialogue activities. So this manual is to guide so that at school level, teachers should know how to go about social dialogue, because if we are to institutionalize social dialogue, definitely there must be a guide. So this guide is already there. And the teacher unions, of course, have not fully used it, but for schools that have access to it, it's working very well. Then we also facilitated the validation of the manual and the development of the joint work plan to foster active participation in social dialogue. What it is, teacher unions express a lot of desire. So for them to be able to get involved, we devised this manual so that we could do a joint work plan, because to leave it on their own, maybe they may not undertake it continuously. So this is joint, bringing the teacher unions together, the Teaching Council of Zambia, and the Ministry of Education on board. And this seems to be a good idea, although not yet fully implemented, but I think it will give us results that we can actually share and learn from. We also conducted a 3-day workshop to digitalize the manual and the national framework on social dialogue in consultation with Technical and Vocational Training College, TVTC, and Charles Lwanga College of Education, CLCE, by the end of October 2023. These are the two colleges that are helping us to advance social dialogue. And as we speak, the manual as well as the framework are in digital form, because one challenge that we faced was to disseminate this information in the manual form. It was difficult to print enough copies, distribute them, but having digitalized, people can now access at least the e-copies just on the platforms. And the two colleges of education seem to have better ICT and better internet connectivity. That is why we use them. Next slide, please. We also conducted a 3-day workshop for train of trainers to equip these trainers with of social dialogue targeting selected in-service teachers. So this training was conducted. We also conducted online training for 400 in-service teachers on how to effectively engage in social dialogue at school level using the digitalized manual and framework, which I talked about. We also, most importantly, identified, awarded, and profiled outstanding teachers during the 2023 World Teachers Day. So with the support from UNESCO, teachers were identified, awarded, and we have a profile of teachers. And this served as a form of motivation. Of course, we did this in consultation with the supervisors of teachers at local level, district level, and provincial levels. So some teachers were awarded through this process. Next slide. We conducted, okay, that one, yes. Challenges. This is a new innovation which cannot go without challenges. So these are some of the critical challenges. I think there are just 3, but of course there are more. But crucially, poor internet connectivity in most places, especially in rural areas. This is a challenge because people could not access the digital information due to lack of connectivity. The other challenge is inadequate IT skills among most participants who struggled with basic IT skills, which led to delays in accessing the course materials, and this negatively impacted their ability to complete the training. Remember, we did some training, so these trainings were online. So because of lack of these IT skills among some teachers, of course, this was a challenge, and I think I must indicate to say a good number of teachers lack basic IT skills in Zambia. But the majority, especially the younger teachers, they are very good at it and so excited to participate in such activities. There was also delayed participant identification. This one came from the provincial education officers, whom we tasked to identify the 400 teachers. They took long to give us feedback, and this delayed the commencement and conclusion of the training. We can proceed. Next slide, please. The way forward. Internet is critical and access to it is very, very important. And this is why we are saying there is need to address the persistent issue of poor internet connectivity, especially in rural areas. Of course, we have brought this to the attention of the ministry, but we also intend to keep engaging other stakeholders so that if internet access is improved, definitely a lot of teachers would access the materials, especially the digital materials. ICT skills are also needed, where we are saying teachers need to be trained at least in basic ICT skills so that they should be able to run on their own and access materials and information properly. Then we are also saying orientation period, where we are saying allowing participants time for orientation on digital platforms before the course begins can improve participation outcomes. We did it quite concurrently, but we are saying I think we should allow participants more time to get the orientation before they actually start the course. Then support from TCZ officials. The involvement of teaching councils and officials in communication channels such as WhatsApp groups proved beneficial. We use our own staff, although not many of them, to make sure that they support teachers. So sometimes we could hold, online meetings with teachers who needed the support so that we can just address some of the challenges that they had. So TCZ staff were actually helped in making sure that this activity progressed. Then the other item is that there is need for a clear implementation plan in order to guide participants on their expected roles after the activity. I think this is a lesson that we can better implement going forward. Next slide, please, if any. Yeah, I think that is where I can end my presentation, but in a nutshell, I can say in Zambia, the social dialogue, the national framework on social dialogue for teachers is a tool which seems to be receiving positive attention, although not yet fully implemented. But from what we have seen and learned among the teacher unions and other stakeholders like the Teaching Service Commission, including other civil society organizations, social dialogue is a tool that even government at higher level is getting interest in. But our onus is to make sure that we market it, we implement it, we draw more lessons, but most importantly, it should be a tool which should help teachers participate in policy formulation and other debates that are important in the delivery of quality education in Zambia and beyond. I thank you.
Dr. Ebimuvanga, thank you so much for that very informative presentation. I think that we've learned a lot from that, and I think that the audience is also, I see a lot of hands coming now. I join in that applause. Very informative, and we do hope that now that we have your slides, we can share them with participants, and that we circulate the good practices that have been test driven in Zambia. Social dialogue as a tool, so important. Thank you for that. Let me turn it over now to a panel that we're going to have between a few individuals. I'd like to move to the International Labor Organization now to hear about social dialogues as the foundation for improved quality and access to education in the perspective of the wider frameworks of the UN's Sustainable Development Goal 4 and Education 2030. So what is the link between social dialogues and improved quality and access to education? So I want to introduce Mr. Oliver Thiang, the head of Public and Private Services Unit and a senior specialist in education, culture, media, and sport in Sectoral Policies Department. and the International Labor Organization, so the ILO. Oliver, so happy to have you here. Please take it from here and feel free to go forward with your presentation. Hanok, the slides, please. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks very much, very happy to be here. I'm joining you from the United States. It's early in the morning here, but it's a real pleasure to be here. As Marianne said, I'm from the International Labor Organization. For those of you who may not know us, we are a United Nations agency based in Geneva that is unique in the UN system because we're tripartite in nature. That means we're made up of governments, labor unions, and employers organizations on equal footing in our governance. So social dialogue, if you want, is built in right into our DNA. Today, I want to talk a little bit about how social dialogue plays an important role in education and what we can do further to strengthen it. So let's get right into it. Perhaps we move to the first slide, please. So as Dr. Mubanga already mentioned, the ILO has a fairly wide definition of social dialogue. It involves all types of negotiation, consultation, and exchange of information among representatives of governments, employers, and workers on common interests in economic, labor, and social policy. So that definition is quite wide. That means you can have social dialogue between just unions and employers, but also you can involve the government, which, as you know, in education, sometimes plays the role of both regulator and employer at the same time. When we talk about social dialogue, we often think of collective bargaining. That is really the hardcore negotiation. Some people imagine unions going on strike or very acrimonious exchanges in back rooms somewhere over a collective agreement. But it can also involve other types of dialogue, which can include sharing of information, which is very important, or consultation. Perhaps the other big principle on this is that these exchanges should take place between representative unions of teachers and of employers or government, as may be the case. As you know, we just heard, for example, the case of Zambia, where teacher unions are fairly well coordinated. In many other countries, of course, there are a plethora of teacher unions, and making sure that these negotiations take place between people who actually represent the workers is really important. So coordination among unions becomes a very important issue. Maybe go back to the next slide. So again, just to reinforce this point, actually, when you think about social dialogue, the widest form of dialogue can actually be exchange of information. And this is something that is really key in the domain of education. Education policy is based on data and knowing exactly how many students there are, how many learners, how many people are leaving school, how many people are completing exams and finishing their degrees, knowing what the teacher supply is, knowing what the teacher demand is, in which areas. These are key pieces of data which drive the recruitment of teachers and which drive the working conditions of teachers. Of course, financial data are also important, knowing exactly how much the budget is for education, knowing what kind of powers the Ministry of Education has in negotiating on teacher wages. These are really key pieces of information. So we found that cooperation between unions and governments on identifying and agreeing on key pieces of information is already a very important step in the social dialogue process. The next level would be consultation. Let's stay on that slide if you don't mind. Consultation is the process whereby you share policy decisions in areas and receive feedback on that to try to shape better policy. That is also a very important aspect. And consultation, as far as the ILO is concerned, does not only affect working conditions, but really should affect all levels of education policy. So, for example, and we'll get into this later, the deployment of technology and IT in the education space is one where teacher input on a substantive level is so important to shape good, strategic, and sustainable decisions on procurement and deployment of IT, for example. And then finally, negotiation, which really is that limited space where we have, for example, collective bargaining. And indeed, by law, that could be limited to certain areas, could be limited to certain aspects of working conditions, can be limited to certain other things that affect teachers directly, such as occupational safety and health. It is one that is very important because it then gets codified in a collective agreement, which then acts as a legal framework for dealing with the working conditions of teachers. But again, negotiation does not have to be limited always to these topics. It has been used, as we've seen, to cover a number of issues. We saw this especially during the COVID-19 crisis, for example, where in some countries, negotiation was used to ensure protocols for the safe return of teachers. Let's go to the next slide then. There's been some talk about is social dialogue wider than just the social partners, so to speak? And certainly in the space of education, it's an important question. As we've said, governments and teacher unions are key partners because they are both the regulators and the employers, and then of course the teacher unions representing the workers. We also know, of course, that private education plays an increasingly important role. And so employers' organizations of private education providers can also be important stakeholders in social and policy dialogue on education. And because, of course, education doesn't only affect teachers, but it affects learners, it affects parents, it affects communities as a whole. There is the importance of also finding structures and fora to bring in civil society organizations and other kinds of stakeholders into the education social dialogue space. Let's move on to the next one. One of the important factors in robust social dialogue is a good enabling environment for social dialogue, and this does have a rights and legal basis. So for the ILO, two key conventions are Convention 87 and 98 on freedom of association and the right to organize and collective bargaining. These are for the ILO fundamental conventions, which means that they are to be applied by ILO member states, which are more or less the same as UNESCO, to apply whether they have ratified or not. And there are actually supervisory mechanisms, notably our Committee on Freedom of Association, which looks at violations of the principles of these conventions, even if the countries have ratified them or not. So the implementation of these two conventions is for the ILO a key aspect of ensuring a framework for robust social dialogue. And I unfortunately do have to note that there are still numerous countries where teacher unions face restrictions with regard to both of these fundamental conventions. Listed there are some other conventions which are relevant to social dialogue. I won't get into these right now, but the first two are really the fundamentals. Let's move on to one next slide, please. I also want to just point out that there are a number of key international instruments concerning teachers specifically. So together with ILO and UNESCO, there is, of course, the recommendation concerning the status of teachers. And the UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel. Both of these draw heavily from ILO standards, and both of them heavily underline the importance of dialogue. They don't mention social dialogue specifically, but they do mention the importance of the involvement of teacher unions in decision making on all aspects of education and teacher policy. And these two instruments are very unique in the international system because they also have a supervisory body attached to them um, that is meeting very shortly next month that looks at how these two uh, recommendations are applied in all member countries of UNESCO and ILO. And indeed, in some cases, it looks at violations of these recommendations as brought to the attention to the committee by teacher unions. So it's an interesting mechanism to look at how these recommendations are applied. Let's go to the next slide. I want to just mention that the institutionalization and the structural support for social dialogue is really important. And I think Dr. Mbanga just gave us a great overview of how Zambia is building this structure and building this culture. We have a number of other countries that have, to some degree, built structures around so building in social dialogue in their policymaking on education. This include Ghana, South Africa, and Senegal, just to name a few from the African region. And I can't underline that social dialogue is not a one-off thing. It is something that has to be supported through permanent and sustainable structures, and it has to be supported through a culture. Social dialogue is not easy. It is not always pleasant, but it is something that has to live within the policymaking culture as a way to move forward. Let's go on to the next one. Just maybe to get into, and I think Dr. Mubanga mentioned this as well, some of the issues where social dialogue seems to be so important. From what we've seen in our research on this area in education, for example, addressing gender and inclusiveness has been a key area where social dialogue has been able to bridge new paths or build new paths, I should say. Looking at bargaining mandates, very important to address, for example, issues of decentralization of education systems, of how wage commissions and teacher commissions operate with regard to finance ministries and education ministries. These are really important issues. We spoke a little bit about union coordination. I want to talk about also social dialogue processes. Yes, there actually has to be also social dialogue about social dialogue. Negotiating or discussing how social dialogue processes can be built is an important part of the social dialogue process itself. I did already mention the importance of private school associations and the private sector in the social dialogue processes. And then maybe just to touch on SDG 4, social dialogue is also a great way for the actors to be involved in the UN planning processes. So that is building social dialogue around how to engage in, for example, United Nations country plans and frameworks, as well as SDG processes is really important. And I think I've mentioned already crisis response like COVID-19 and technology. Let's go to the next one. In forthcoming research, it should be published, I believe, early next year. The ILO is once again looking at the impact of so-called peak level social dialogue, including peak level social dialogue in sectors. And one of the conclusions that's coming out of the literature review is what I mentioned before, social dialogue is not easy. In the short run, social dialogue is not the way to go. If you are an education minister and you want to show your president that you have cut the budget by 20% or that you have built another 20 schools, then social dialogue is not necessary. You simply do it by fiat. And if people protest and if people go on strike, then so be it. Sometimes political careers are short. But if the goal is long-term success, if the goal is buy-in by the very people that need to deliver the outcomes you're looking for, the overwhelming evidence is that social dialogue does build long-term and inclusive results. They bring in also other stakeholders. Social dialogue has been seen from the literature as being particularly effective in reducing income inequality. This is perhaps less of an issue in education, where wages, for example, can be set by decree. But in the private sector, for example, it is as something that has had a particular effect. There is clear evidence that social dialogue can also, in the long run, increase productivity and facilitate digital transitions and environmental transitions, for that matter, as well. And in some of the research that we've looked at from countries like the ones listed here, Argentina, Canada, Denmark, Ghana, Singapore, the US, and of course, Zambia, we are seeing that social dialogue can indeed bring about better results in the education space. Let's move on to the next one. I want to just end maybe with this something about negotiation. And I want to go back to what I said at the beginning. When people think of negotiation, they think of very hardcore yelling fights in back rooms over collective bargaining. But that's actually not what the ILO is supporting. What the ILO would like to do is to emphasize the importance of interest-based negotiation. And I think this is one that's really exciting in the education space. Whenever I meet with education unions or when I meet with education ministries, there is an incredible confluence, and there's an incredible agreement on actually what the common goals are. People want to build good education systems because not only is it good for teachers, it's good for the students, it's good for the country. We know that education is probably the most significant investment countries can make in their economic and social development. So when the parties walk into a room and they have this common goal, it's much more interesting to agree on those common goals and work backwards from there and see where the differences start. What are the different needs besides the interests? And we found that in various exercises on this, that once you look at it from this approach, getting away from simply a wage figure or getting away from simply a number of hours that have to be worked, it is much easier to agree and also find common solutions. So I want to just put this out there because collective bargaining, which is difficult, is also a pathway for building common solutions and more lasting solutions. And we have seen some examples of countries that have been able to do that. So please don't be afraid of collective bargaining. I think that brings me to the end. If I'm not sure, there might be one more slide. Yes, indeed, that is the end, perfectly on time. So I hope that's helped you think a little bit about social dialogue. Thank you very much.
Oliver, thank you so much for that. Very powerful, very informative. I have the triangle now in my head, so I think it's a great visual. Rest assured, everyone, we will be sharing this information with everybody, even for those that weren't able to join today after the webinar. So you'll have access to these resources. Oliver, thank you so much again. I'd like us to continue the conversation, and for those of you that are participants, please do ask your questions in the chat box. We realize this is a lot of information and you have comments and questions, and some of you are even sharing what you're researching in your PhD programs right now, which is really great to have that kind of participation as well. So please share and post, comment in the chat box. We're going to have a good Q&A soon after this, and we're going to begin with your questions that you're posting here now. So let's continue the conversation. I'd like to bring in Education International to weigh in on the extent of social dialogue institutionalization in sub-Saharan Africa. So how has it been institutionalized? What have been some of the legal and institutional frameworks and current practices in social dialogue for teachers? I'd like to introduce Mr. Pedi Anawi, the Regional Coordinator of Education International Africa. So Pedi, please feel free to open your camera so we can see you, and if you're able to. And Hannah, could we have Pedi's slides, please? Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Marianne. Yes, I am Pedi Anawi, Regional Coordinator at the Secretariat of Education International, which is based in Accra, Ghana. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. And I'm happy to meet everyone here online to discuss this issue, which is of great concern to education sector trade unions. Yes, I think Dr. Ebi and Oliver, who has just spoken, have already commented on the concept of social dialogue and made it clearer. And so I'm not going to waste time anyway for the sake of time. I will just pass. But before we go to the second slide, I would like to repeat once more that social dialogue helps achieve a more equitable and sustainable society, as it helps reduce inequality, it helps improve working conditions, and that's what we are fighting for. It enhances participatory democracy. It provides legitimacy and ownership to public policies. And this one, for us as teacher unions, it's very important. Next slide, please. Yes. Well, let us see. Education International is the Global Federation of Teacher Unions. And as such, Education International defends or aims at a number of objectives, including the defense of the working conditions of teachers, the promotion of quality, inclusive education for all, especially an education provided by and regulated by public powers. And therefore, Education International is guided by a number of statutory texts, and these include the Constitution of Education International, the bylaws, but also in addition to these statutory texts, these constitutional texts, Education International develops policy papers that helps guide its work towards its objectives. That's how Education International developed a policy paper on human and trade union rights. And this is the document in EI that has a number of facts related to social dialogue. And for that, we will just recall a number of relevant items from that policy dialogue. And EI is, and according to that policy, EI is guided by the principles of human and trade union rights and by its commitment to democracy, equity, and social justice. It promotes and protects the rights of education sector workers and advocates for inclusive quality education, as I said a few minutes ago. Well, this policy paper has been developed by Education International, and it was based on the rule of law and the principles of human and trade union rights as enshrined in various international and regional treaties, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ILO conventions and recommendations. EI policy paper on human and trade union rights recognizes social dialogue as the best avenue to achieve the rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining, as stated in the ILO Convention 87 and 98. Next slide, please. Yeah. So according to our policy paper on human and trade union rights, education union aim to use social dialogue to achieve, number one, education as a human right. Number 2, participation of teachers in education reform or policy processes. Number 3, achieve professional interests of educators. And number 4, achieve trade union rights. Next slide, please. Based on that, EI has carried out a number of surveys and studies in order to assess the effectiveness of social dialogue in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Among these surveys, I can list a regional survey that EI Africa carried out in 2020, and if you remember, 2020 was the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we wanted to assess the response of teachers through their unions to the school closures as a result of the pandemic. And therefore, we realized a number of things. A number of our affiliates of our member organizations, teacher unions, reported that they were involved in the process of decision-making for the closure or the reopening of schools. And a certain number, although small, indicated that they were not involved. And even among those who were involved, some of them indicated that their views were taken into account, and others, their views were not, they were consulted, but their views were not taken into account. And then, apart from that, we selected a sample of countries where we carried out a study, a kind of contextual analysis of the structural, political, and socio-economic mechanisms that influence teacher unions' possibility to engage in social or policy dialogue. Well, we did this with the view of influencing education policies and advancing the workers' rights. And these two countries were Sierra Leone and Chad. And the result, next slide, please. The results is quite interesting. Number 1, Sierra Leone, the study indicates that the labor policies and legislations have had a long history dating as far back as 1930s. And then these legislations and policies have been consistent with international labor-related frameworks that Sierra Leone is signatory. And then looking at social dialogue as per se, in Sierra Leone, the study concluded that, well, they have set up a number of platforms, a number of institutions that ensures effectiveness of social dialogue. And in conclusion, we think that anyway, the research concluded that there is positive implementation of the labor market-related framework, which is consistent with international labor standard. However, what I can say, and which was not highlighted by the study, is that we chose Sierra Leone based on a number of problems that teachers are facing in the country. When we think the teacher union over there, we have only one teacher union. We thought the teacher union, if they had an operational social dialogue framework, the teacher union, which is our member organization, should easily go into negotiation with the government. That's where we realized, indeed, as concluded by the research, there is social dialogue structure, but sometimes we need more than the text. We need more than the agreement on paper that teacher unions and government, or teacher unions and employers, should go into social dialogue. And one of these things we need is that we need a dynamic organization representing the worker. And that's what we have been working on. Next slide, please. The next country was Chad. For the same purpose, we wanted to assess the structural, economic, and political forces that makes it possible for teacher unions to go into social dialogue or policy dialogue with governments. Surprisingly, in Chad, or in contrary to Sierra Leone, in Chad, it doesn't work. The study revealed that they have had a number of agreements since 1992, but none of them has been implemented or none of them has been respected. And this is why every time there is social unrest in Chad. But also, we went beyond the simple analysis. What might be the reason why there are agreements for social dialogue, there are frameworks, there are platforms, but these platforms are hardly operational. Then we realize that in Chad, unlike Sierra Leone, we have a multitude of organizations representing education sector workers. And this splinterism of the teacher voice might be one of the reasons that weakens teachers' capacity to participate effectively in a social dialogue. Next slide, please. And then from there, from these three surveys, well, we had another survey, yes, that is in Zimbabwe, to explore, well, the effectiveness of social dialogue in response to the first wave of COVID school closure. In Zimbabwe, the outcome was clear. Teacher unions participated in the process of decisions for the closing, for the delivery of education using distance methods, and even for the reopening. And even teachers have benefited, negotiated, and benefited from a number of things to help them stand the impact of COVID. Next slide, please. Well, in conclusion, these surveys reveal that social dialogue is effective in some cases, but it's not effective in other cases. And from there, EI Africa went to propose a social dialogue framework, which we hope will be taken to governments and will encourage, will be accepted by governments so that a number of decisions are put in place to ensure that social dialogue exists. Exactly just like Dr. Ebi and Oliver Liang said, to set up a kind of enabling environment and a legal framework for social dialogue to exist. And according to the framework, just to summarize it, the framework proposed by EI Africa calls for a number of things, including the systematization of social dialogue in all African countries, the ratification of international labor conventions, recommendations, and standards, the alignment of national labor laws with international labor standards, the development of mechanisms for direct negotiations with teacher unions, the negotiation on terms and conditions for the social dialogue itself, and then for educators' work. And then the adoption of collective bargaining agreements, legal settlements of industrial disputes, the establishment of consultative bodies in each country, and also the participation of teacher unions in civil dialogue? Well, in short, this is the experience of Education International. These are some of the facts that we have been able to collect concerning social dialogue in sub-Saharan African countries. And so in conclusion, we think that just like Saliu Sal said in his opening remark, teachers are central to the achievements of inclusive quality education. And the whole world through the SDG 4 is calling for that. Therefore, teachers must be allowed to participate in the decisions aimed to address issues on education. And to finish, in EI, we strongly believe that nothing about teachers works without teachers. Therefore, social dialogue with education unions is paramount. Thank you very much.
Hetty, thank you so much. That ending line, nothing about teachers can happen without teachers, is so powerful, is so true. I don't think there's anything more that I can say to wrap that up. Well said. Colleagues, we're going to take forward this conversation, and please do continue the conversation in the chat box. We are getting a lot of good questions, a lot of good comments, a lot of interaction. So let's keep it up. And I'd like to ask another speaker to weigh in on what are some of the good practices happening in their countries. So we just heard from Petty some of the good practices in several countries. Let's zoom in on one country. Mr. Philbert Baguma, the Secretary General of the Uganda National Teachers Union, is going to share what's been working in Uganda to establish social dialogues for teachers, and what does some of the evidence show on the impact of the dialogue. So over to you, Philbert. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Good afternoon and good morning, colleagues. This is Baguma Philbert Bates, General Secretary, Uganda National Teachers Union. And I'm going to present on the social and policy dialogue platforms that elevate teachers' voices in Uganda. Let's go to the next slide. This is the outline. The definitions have been shared by almost all presenters, so I may not go through the definitions again, but we shall look at the background. We shall look at the social dialogue framework for teachers in Uganda, then the experience we have as an institution, best practices, challenges, and then recommendations. Next slide. So these ones have been gone through. Let's go to the next. Yes, Uganda National Teachers Union, in partnership with the Ministry of Education and Sports and with support funding from UNESCO, have been organizing social dialogue meetings for education stakeholders as a pre-activity for World Teachers' Day celebrations since 2017. And these have been held at regional level. We have held also social dialogue meetings with members of parliament at national level to discuss issues that arose from these regional meetings. Next slide. So, social dialogue framework is embedded within the national teacher policy that was officially launched in Uganda in 2019. In line with the provisions of the framework, social dialogues should bring various key stakeholders to focus on teacher professionalism, welfare issues, living and working conditions. And number two, they should create a reliable platform for capturing teachers' voices and their concerns in decision making and policy formulation. Next slide. The framework mainly aims to achieve the following objectives. One is to institutionalize social dialogue for teachers in Uganda. Number two is to create an enabling environment for social dialogue between key partners, which has been a missing link. Then three is to promote the involvement of teachers, key partners, and the public in decision-making and policy formulation on teachers and educational issues in the country. We are all aware of reforms that come in place, but quite often, some very little or minimal participation of teachers and other stakeholders is normally seen. Then four is to guide the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of social dialogue for teachers in Uganda. Next slide. So how have we implemented these social dialogues in Uganda? In 2018, the Ministry of Education and Sports, supported by UNESCO, conducted some activities within the national teacher policy. And the Ministry of Education decided to work with UNATU to organize and conduct these social dialogues within a number of regions. So in the photo, you can see one of the regional social dialogue meetings in Western Uganda. This was far back in 2018. Next slide. So how do we arrange them? The best practice, we are numbering these practices one after the other as experiences which we have gone through. Number one is the thematic focus of the social dialogues. While there are many teacher issues, our social dialogues focus on broader issues depending on the prevailing situation. We have held dialogues on teacher effectiveness. And of course, when we talk about teacher effectiveness, we cover issues like performance. We look at what teachers need to do their work. Then we look at teacher gaps. There are glaring gaps in terms of staffing in all schools and education institutions across, and then teacher welfare issues. We cannot expect much from the teachers when the teachers are really, the welfare is not catered for, the rebels are attacking the schools and killing children and teachers and all that. And how have we been doing it? The planning and organization of these social dialogues. UNATU organizes these social dialogues in a partnership with the other strategic partners. We give out tasks such as facilitation, moderation, and then different partners handle different issues during the sessions. And UNATU has been working very closely with the UNESCO and Ministry of Education and Sports. And this is a very strong partnership which we have built. Next slide. This is participant selection. We ensure that the participants include policymakers, line ministries, education development partners, the teachers, teacher representative unions, heads of schools and education institutions, school management committees, parents, teachers associations, parents, and all these actors have a role to play in supporting teachers to play their roles. Next slide. Best practice number 4 is session organization. UNATO ensures that teachers have ample time to voice their concerns. This is done through open plenary sessions, small group discussions, and presentations and panel discussions. UNATO also ensures that the program gives time to the teachers to share their experiences, because the teachers work within these local governments. And you can see the attention they are giving to the one who is presenting, a sign to show that people are interested in listening to this information. And when teachers air out these views, they feel relieved because they know they have aired them in the presence of the stakeholders who are supposed to find possible solutions to these challenges. Next slide. So best practice number 5 is the session outcome. We have our sessions usually culminate into the development of an advocacy paper or issues paper that clearly outlines the identified challenges, the recommended way forward, and the responsible centers to handle these issues. This issues paper is used by the Union for Advocacy at national level and to follow up on the agreed actions at the district level. Next slide. This is part of the team of the members of Education and Sports Committee of Parliament after the National Social Dialogue meeting. Next. Now, the impact of UNATO's social dialogue sessions. Teachers voicing their concerns in the presence of stakeholders, which is a mileage, because quite often there is no platform for teachers to air out their views and what they go through. Then stakeholders' appreciation of the communication gaps between them and the teachers. The distances are not very long because these are teachers working in the local governments, but those in the office and those in the field do not communicate to each other. Even when the communication is made, it does not reach to the intended beneficiaries. Then stakeholders getting to understand what teachers go through when they are not aware and yet they are so close to them. Stakeholders demanding to have social dialogue sessions at lower levels and regularly. This was very much emphasized in these regional meetings, and they are demanding that let them scale down to the district and scale down to the sub-counties so that the issues can come out and the blame games end instead of keeping blaming one another when the issues can be sorted out. Then stakeholders demanding strategic partners realizing a lot of issues affecting teacher performance. Because the teacher without salary will not go to class and teach. It is obvious. A teacher who has been deleted without reason cannot concentrate on teaching. What are the challenges envisaged? Responsible centers do not usually give feedback on urgent issues that are raised in the issues paper. So sometimes the issues paper is made, advocacy is done, follow-up is made, but the response is sluggish. Bureaucratic tendencies in providing solutions to the issues that affect teachers' performance. Because when issues are brought and they have to go through that bureaucratic system, the teachers keep waiting for feedback. Meanwhile, they are not effectively doing their work. Poor interpretation of government policies by responsible officers, hence uncoordinated implementation. You find in one region, they are implementing the policy different from another region. And of course, information goes across and you find the teachers now confused in the middle along the way. Limited resources, which limit the number of participants. Because even when we talk about having these social dialogues at the region, we draw the participants from the local governments. And we cannot bring all participants. For example, when we target the education officers, we target chief administrative officers, we target cows, we cannot bring all of them. So we just make sample selection and the time is never enough because the resources are not enough. And that also curtails the sample size of the people to meet. Next slide. Virtual sessions are not effective, which makes physical sessions the best option. However, this makes social dialogues very expensive. The facilitators and the participants must be facilitated with transport, hiring of venues, and other costs. And this makes it a bit expensive because when you look at the virtual sessions, a number of challenges like poor connectivity, internet connectivity, less concentration by the participants. The sessions need a lot of time, and with the online sessions, most participants may not attend free. They will be attracted by other domestic issues, and you end up not having full attention. Next slide. So, with these challenges and others not mentioned here, we have these recommendations to make. That government should structure the social dialogues right from the lower levels to the national level such that implementation becomes easier. There should be more structured monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to follow up on the agreed action points with the responsible centers. Regular engagement should be held with the policymakers to keep the debate on education issues alive at national level. Next. Government should provide a budget line for social and policy dialogues so that it is a priority because it is a shortcut to solve so many issues that affect service delivery, especially in the teaching learning process. Then implementation guidelines should be developed and implemented with specific timelines and responsible centers. The last one is to thank you very much for your audience.
Thank you so much, Philbert, for that very detailed, very instructive presentation. And I see a lot of applause hands in the chat box. I really want to make the attendees feel that they are part of this, although it's a webinar and not really a direct conversation. I think we're doing I think we have a lot of questions in the chat box and they just keep coming. So a lot of good reactions to your presentation, Filbert. Just a great presentation. Thank you. Now
welcome.
we're almost done with our panel discussion. Dr. Epping Babunga, we had thought that because you weighed in a little bit about Zambia in the beginning of the presentation today, you might want to just, since we're now talking about countries, we have the example of Uganda. If you wanted to react to anything and add to what you've said briefly related to social dialogue in Zambia before we open it up to audience questions. Did you want to add anything else?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. At least I'm happy that my camera is now here. And
yes, so good to see you.
Of course, I will not give a structured PowerPoint presentation, but I think I have some notes to which I can speak briefly, more briefly, in addition to the things that I spoke about. I'm happy to note what Oliver indicated to say social dialogue is not easy. I must agree. It's not easy and it's not a one-off thing. No, it's a process. Yeah, but rather than it being a problem-solving tool, it should also be a tool for continued and sustained collaboration. If well managed, social dialogue can resolve a lot of issues and time would be spent more profitably on teaching, especially at school level, rather than having meetings to resolve issues. So it is something that I think schools and government systems must invest in because it saves the cost of holding meetings to resolve conflicts. And I think in the education sector, we need to mainstream it. But what I've also noticed in Zambia, when the policy was published, I was sharing with one of the government ministers at high level, who was very, very interested. When he read through the document, he thought this policy or this framework yes, can be used in the mainstream government beyond just education. But what we want to do, especially that the Teaching Council of Zambia is participating in social dialogue, we would really want to make it more viable in education because this is where it has emerged from. And I think for us as an institution, with collaboration from UNESCO, support from the Ministry of Education, we just want to make sure that social dialogue is institutionalized in Zambia. For example, you know, we have about 12 teacher unions in Zambia. 12 teacher unions in Zambia. But previously, we just used to have one. But because of frustration or unresolved differences, some members or leaders from these teacher unions would break away to go and form theirs. So you can see this indicates to say social dialogue needs to be used more so that we strengthen the teacher's voice, because by having so many splinter unions, we are not solving the problem. We are actually weakening the teacher's voice. So we are really trying to bring teacher unions together. And I think Pedi, you started a project in Zambia under Education International, where you were engaging teacher unions so that maybe they can come together, and you did not conclude that. So I would want to encourage Education International to try to use social dialogue in bringing institutions together. Instead of just using it maybe within the institution, we can also use social dialogue to bring certain parties together. Yeah, so what is important is to identify stakeholders, and which in Zambia we have done. There are certain elements of social dialogue that exists when we meet certain organizations, but I think it needs to be more strengthened so that it really bears the fruit. But at school level, I see weaknesses of how social dialogue is being implemented, except for certain schools. So if you compare how social dialogue maybe has been received and how it is being used in different schools, you will see variations. Of course, sometimes because of the initiative of the school administration and also the work culture and also just general school atmosphere. In certain schools, it is working better than in other settings. So we need to change the narrative so that we should market more of social dialogue, I think, than leaving it just like that. So in Zambia, it is working quite slowly at school level, and we just want to appreciate UNESCO for having initiated the process And then what we are also trying to do is to engage colleges of education and universities so that when trainee teachers or students are being trained to become teachers, they should be oriented or introduced to social dialogue practices such that when they become teachers, it will not be difficult for them to continue participating in social dialogue. So it is a skill or it is an approach that can be introduced earlier enough before students graduate from the university or from the college. I think they need to understand the value and the importance of social dialogue. And as Teaching Council of Zambia, we really want to push this agenda forward. And what we can see is that through social dialogue, where it is working, there is a strengthened engagement and collaboration in those selected schools. And I think it also needs a conducive, it creates a conducive learning or teaching environment where social dialogue is used. Actually, the working environment is quite cordial. And I think this is one motivation why it should just be supported or promoted. And then it also helps improve the school governance and leadership system. Although we don't have a research maybe to present findings, but we have just sampled to see how it is working well. But I think to commission just a research or a survey would help us to understand the actual impact of social dialogue. But from what we have seen, because even in certain provinces where we did not go, remember I mentioned that we only went to 2 provinces from 10, we have 10 provinces, but we only went to 2. But what was exciting is that even the districts which we did not include in the pilot project, when they learned of it, they became positively anxious, wanting to learn more about social dialogue. So this is a motivation to say it is something that can be well received, but what we need to do is just to double our efforts so that we quickly cover as much area where schools are as possible. And this way, we can, I think, be sure to say we have marketed social dialogue, and the national framework, I think, properly. So having said that, I just want to indicate that in Zambia, of course, it's a two-way thing. Some schools seem to be doing fine. They are trying, but I think that is dependent on other factors. But I think the popularization or the marketing of social dialogue is what we are trying to emphasize on, so that the policy or the framework that we have done should not just remain on the desk. And the fact that it is digitalized now would help us to actually reach out to other places where we cannot go physically. And then we can also hold online meetings. But like the last speaker has spoken, sometimes when you are just initiating a program, face-to-face meetings work better, and then follow-ups can be virtual. But I think the efforts are just being initiated. And I think with the support from government, which in my view, we have a lot of support from the minister. Remember, I mentioned to say even the launch of the framework was done by the minister. And this is the type of support that has helped for us to score the strides that we have scored so far. So social dialogue is a tool that can help institutions come together. You start together, you continue together, and I think you conclude together and very, very successfully. So it is something that should be institutionalized. Even in the Teaching Council of Zambia, we are using social dialogue so that we can identify and resolve some of the staff issues. And like the last speaker indicated, when people listen to, hear that you are taking, a critical ear or listening to their concerns, they feel included, and I think the tension is actually minimized. So that's what I can say for now, in addition to the presentation that I gave. These notes I can share with Victoria so that they are part of the notes to be shared later. Thank you very much.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Ebimubanga. Very well said. I think a lot of takeaways there. I'm thinking about them now, and I see that our chat box is full of questions of people who are also thinking about your comments and everyone's comments today. What a rich discussion we're having there. We're going to take this forward, and we're going to have a Q&A session now, a question and answer session, starting with your questions in the chat box. But right before we do that, I want to draw attention to a link that we've shared in the chat box. We would like to take your feedback via a survey link on how you think that the webinar has gone today, and if we've missed anything, if you think that we can continue this conversation. We're really eager to continue these types of discussions. There's no end really to them. So please give us some feedback about what you would like to see in future discussions and how today's discussion has gone. It'll just take 3-5 minutes of your time. Right, so you have to copy and paste the link in the browser if it doesn't open for you when you click on it. So let's have a question and answer session, beginning with what you've already shared in the chat box. A lot of comments have come through. I'd like to call on my colleague, Yvonne Maboya. She is my colleague in the KIX Africa 19 Hub project here at IICBA, and she is our research consultant. She's going to handle the question and answer session. So over to you, Yvonne.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you to all the speakers. Quite engaging discussions, and I can see from the comments that are coming in the chat that there are a lot of questions, a lot of observations, but most importantly, there's a lot of appreciation for all the presentations that have been made today. And just to echo what Saliu said and what Perry said, that this is all about teachers, and nothing can be done without teachers, especially about teachers. I really like that statement. And so we've got a lot of comments, specifically just appreciating all that have been shared, and a lot of people are learning from what has been presented. So I'll just read a few comments, and then I'll go into the question section for us to be able to respond. One of the comments that has been made is social dialogue is crucial for understanding expectations from teachers and education sector regarding quality education. I think all of us have come out of this webinar with that in mind. And then there's also some observation that one of the challenges of too many trade unions representing teachers, especially in Africa, include that sometimes it needs to take a little bit of effort to dialogue for their members' welfare. So there has to be some sort of a nudge from the teachers for them to be able to represent them. There's also the issue of political interference. There's a participant who said that political interference kills the strength of these social unions and hence affecting the possibility of social dialogues. So those are just a few of the comments. Most of the comments are coming in just to appreciate the presentations. And then I'll go to the question section, and maybe I'll start with some questions addressed to Dr. Ebi. So the first one is, I am a teacher in Central Province. I believe this is in Zambia, and I have never heard of anything to do with social dialogue. The second question is, a very good initiative and clear presentation. Did you consider blended approach for your teacher training? And what were the follow-up activities after the training? This is coming from Christine. And then the third question, also a follow-up to that, Dr. Ebi, is Christine is associated with Jessie, and she's saying, we train teachers on the use of technology for teaching and learning. I'm just wondering how we can incorporate a component of social dialogue in the model. So Dr. Ebi, I don't know whether you'll take those three or I give you the last one. I think you have 4 directed to you. Should I give you the last one so that you answer all of them?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so the fourth question is, considering the fact that they are interacting in internal and external school factors that make each school have unique needs and priorities, what strategic approaches are employed to ensure that implementation outcomes of the national framework in Zambia are, to a very great extent, inclusive and equitable in the best interest of every school? So maybe you can take those 4 and then we'll ask the next question. Over to you, Dr. Ebi.
Okay, thank you very much for Thank you very much for the questions. Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. For the teacher in Central Province, like I indicated, when we did the pilot, we selected the Copperbelt Province, which is about 300 kilometers from Lusaka. And also we went to Livingstone, which is about 600 kilometers from Lusaka. Of course, Central Province is just about less than 200 kilometers from Lusaka. So we went to one province which is slightly further, and the other province which was also on the other side. But ideally, we would like to have all provinces engaged. Now, I mentioned that we identified 400 teachers through provincial education officers, and these came from all the 10 provinces. So we have started, except that the scale could not allow us to include everybody at the same time. I would have loved this teacher to give me his or her district, so that I can know how follow-ups can actually be ensued to ensure that this person hears about social dialogue. It is something that has been heard about, especially by provincial officers, except that sometimes when we sensitize them, they may take a bit of time to scale it down to the school level. But what I can assure you is that for those that have participated in our meetings, it is something that is very exciting, because teachers in Zambia have a lot of problems. And I know some of the problems with the 12 teacher unions, they feel the teacher unions have neglected them. So when you bring teachers around to listen to them, to raise their issues, not just to appease them, but with a view that their issues should be followed up and resolved, I think teachers become comfortable that way. It's a question of time. I know you can have our contacts from Teaching Council of Zambia, call us so that we can give you more information. But social dialogue is in Zambia and it has come to stay. That one I can guarantee you. Then are we using a blended approach for teacher training, and what is the follow-up? Of course, for the two teacher unions, teacher training colleges that we are using, TVTC on the Copperbelt and Charles Lwanga in Southern Province, these are colleges that have well-developed ICT systems, and their network connectivity is far much better than most of the public training institutions. And that is the more reason why we use them. But definitely, it is one step at a time. Yes, we have met them physically. We are also making follow-ups using virtual meetings. And I would say if we combine the physical meetings or one-to-one meetings, including the virtual meetings, to some extent, we are blending. Apart from that, we have also digitalized the document or the framework itself, which is available, which you can actually access on these two colleges' websites. And we also have some flyers, some information about social dialogue. And each time we have a meeting as Teaching Council of Zambia, we can have a meeting, a physical meeting, we talk about social dialogue. Sometimes we talk about social dialogue on radio or television. Sometimes we use literature. So we use various ways of packaging the information so that we can make this information available. I know Zambia is a big country. You might have missed some of our meetings or part of the literature, but definitely with the TVTC and Charles Lwanga, this information is available.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ebi. Just one more question that has come in while you are speaking is about access. How can someone who is interested...
And also the Teaching Council of Zambia is available. With provincial education officers, it is equally available. I think we can get far and we can reach out to many, many people. So we are trying to use technology as much as possible, except that sometimes in certain areas, connectivity, like I earlier indicated, seems to be a problem. But where possible, we are using all means possible so that technology should come in to help us reach out where we can't go physically. Then internal and external factors, what strategies in order to implement for inclusion and equality? Yes, definitely. The goodness, there was a mention, I think, by one of the presenters earlier, I can't remember who talked, I think it is Oliver, who talked about the need to have social dialogue or to dialogue around social dialogue. So first of all, we need to discuss what are the factors that actually, impede on the implementation of social dialogue. And once we identify both external and internal factors, definitely we can then see how best to include. But we start at the center. Usually in Zambia, we use a cascaded model where we first of all orient maybe people from the ministry headquarters, then we go to the provincial headquarters, we go to the districts, and then from there we scale down to schools. We also use zones in order to reach out to schools, and usually schools may be the last ones to be reached out. Fortunately, in Zambia, we have resource centers, district resource centers, which are found in every district. We also use them so that at least we can reach out. Then we don't use our own structures. We use the structures of the ministry. But our desire is that each time the ministry is having a meeting, a big meeting, we could have a slot so that we can also have a discussion. And this discussion, because social dialogue is a cross-cutting issue, no sector should be left behind. No department should be left behind. No gender should be left behind. No one. I think you should make it as inclusive as possible so that everybody benefits from this one. It is an approach which can, I think, be used to resolve a lot of issues, and most importantly, to see how best we can interact, collaborate, and achieve together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mubanga, and apologies, I interrupted you at some point. I think you froze and I thought you were done. Sorry for that. So there's one more question that has come in. How can one access the national framework for social dialogue? Is it online?
Thank you very much. Depending on where this person is, like I indicated, the copies that we physically printed with support from UNESCO were only 1,000. We only had 1,000 copies. And these are the copies that we shared with provincial education officers. Of course, if somebody is in Lusaka, we have very few copies just for ops custody, which if somebody walked in, even today or tomorrow, we can share. But where they cannot reach us physically, we have a digital version of the National Framework on Social Dialogue. What we just need, let's know, give us your email address so that we can share this one anytime, even now, even tomorrow. So the digital version is available and it makes work easier. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mubanga. Great response there. So I'll go to the next batch of questions, and this goes to Oliver. So thanks so much for the wonderful presentation. My question is, how can social dialogue among teachers, learners, and school administrators help to promote environmental awareness and sustainability in emergency contexts? So that is coming from Marlock, and is directed to Oliver. Question number 2, given that social dialogue calls for ongoing dialogue between citizens and governments, including educators, what is the value of social dialogue in education when African governments often impose reforms without adequate consultation? How can we address the disconnect between education policies and the needs of teachers and citizens? Because of this, education policies often produce serious disconnect between the various domains of society and even industries, thereby producing learners who eventually become social misfits and increasing unemployment. It's a loaded one. So again, that is for Oliver. And lastly, how is or can social dialogue support or promote disability inclusive education for primary and secondary schools? So Oliver, you have those 3 that you can respond to. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and very interesting questions. So on environmental transitions, I think this is a really key issue. For the ILO, that is a very important issue. We have guidelines on the so-called just transition, because it is well known that the transition from our current carbon-based energy models to more sustainable And climate-friendly energy models will imply big transitions, big changes in the way we work. And unfortunately, as in all big changes in the world of work, they tend to affect workers the most, especially poorer workers. So ensuring social justice in that regard is really key. And social dialogue is seen as a key factor in this. The forthcoming research that the ILO will publish will look at, for example, industries such as the energy industry, which are going to be heavily impacted, and how social dialogue has actually helped workers in that industry look at alternative employment opportunities, training, support for engaging in the just transition as ways of ensuring that these people are not left behind in energy transitions. And I think the same principles can be applied easily in social dialogue in education, as education itself has to look at both making its infrastructure more climate sustainable, but of course also in getting teachers to teach sustainability, which implies teacher training, of course, but also a lot of support, because climate change is something that is dynamic. It's something that's impacting very quickly, and teachers are going to be essential in preparing learners for this issue, but also supporting, frankly, the mental challenge that some of these issues and anxiety that some of these issues are going to solicit. I don't have any good examples off the top of my head of where this is being done right now, but we know also from the COVID crisis how social dialogue was key in a number of countries in developing quick protocols for the return of teachers and learners, and also for developing safety protocols. On the question of how to get governments to engage in social dialogue where they're reluctant to do so, I think that's a really important one. I've answered that in the chat. To summarize, I would suggest two things. One is a lot of governments simply don't have the habit, they don't have the culture of social dialogue. Perhaps there was bad and traumatic history with industrial relations in the education sector before, and those kinds of things tend to um, determine what behavior is like. What we've seen is that when unions and governments try to collaborate on low-hanging fruit, on topics where there's already a lot of consensus, on topics where the budgetary implications would not be so big, on topics where outcomes might be easier to reach, for example, on COVID-19 protocols, on certain occupational safety and health issues, protocols on dealing with violence and harassment, some measures to improve gender equality, and where those things can be monitored and evaluated easier. Those are win-win situations for governments and for unions, and where the social dialogue process can be piloted. And if there's common success in those, that's something that both unions and governments can label as successes, and it becomes a win-win thing. That might be one way to get governments to understand the feasibility and the benefits of social dialogue. Another thing would be joint training on social dialogue. We've done that, and it seems to be a way for governments to and unions to test in neutral ground how these kinds of processes could work. Or even on joint research, looking at topics where there might be a joint interest, and there's teacher unions and governments can combine their forces to really get some good data on issues. That's another way to start the social dialogue process. And I think on the question of disability, that's a really, really important one. I unfortunately don't off the top of my head, other than from highly developed countries, have examples where this has been addressed through social dialogue. It is a key issue. Certainly, first step is that unions have to take this on as an important issue, disability inclusion. It's a technical issue that involves a lot of thinking about how education policy and what kinds of disabilities are dealt with and what kind of infrastructure and support is needed, what kind of training is needed. So it's a very, very comprehensive issue. And since it is such a important one now with the inclusion agenda under Education 2030, it can only be through social dialogue, really, that you're going to get good results. Because ultimately, at the very technical level, teachers and education support personnel are going to be key in delivering this. It requires a lot of sensitivity. It requires a lot of, I think, training on different kinds of situations. So it is one that to plan well and to implement well, social dialogue would be absolutely key. Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver. I'd request participants to give us just a few more minutes. I think there are two questions that are key that I'd like to pose to Mr. Peddy, and then we'll just close after that. I hope that is okay. Just give us a few more minutes, maybe 8 more minutes, if that's okay with you. Sebi, I'll ask a question. One, there's a participant from Burkina Faso who is asking, I would like to know if Education International also conducted a survey in Burkina Faso where access to formal education has become limited as a result of political instability and activities of violent extremism in the last 3 years. That's the first question. And then the second question, how could social dialogue for teachers work in practice? How can every teacher's voice be heard? Should this be facilitated by the head teacher, teacher representative, the Ministry of Education, or parliament members representing teachers, as a case in Rwanda? What is the practical approach? So I think Oliver's touched a little bit on it, so maybe you can also just talk to that. Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yvonne. Yeah, starting from the first and the easiest question about the comrade from Burkina Faso who wanted to know whether EI had conducted a survey. Unfortunately, no, we haven't. Burkina Faso is not one of the countries selected for specific analysis of social dialogue. However, in my presentation, I indicated that EI undertook a regional survey on how teachers responded to COVID-19, that was 2020-2021. And Burkina Faso, just like any other country from Africa, was involved. So we do not have specific information on social dialogue from Burkina Faso as per se. The other question, I think Oliver has already responded and better than I could have done. Well, but I think if I may take the risk, what we call social dialogue can take different levels. It can go from the school level up to the district level and up to the regional, province or national levels. So, but we as Education International, we think that teacher unions should be independent organizations, free from any influence. Therefore, they mention that if a member of parliament can, well, the member of parliament goes to parliament on the mandate of a political party, which may not represent, which may not meet and reflect the interests of teachers as workers, both neutral and partisan. And therefore, we think that teacher unions are the best place to speak for teachers, for the workers in education, in social dialogue. Thanks so much, Yvonne.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peddy. Allow me now to give it back to Marianne. Marianne, over to you.
Thank you, Yvonne. We really could have gone on much longer, I think, because it seems like the conversation is just getting started and we have a lot of questions still coming up in the chat box, but we've done our best to incorporate some of them in the limited time we have left. And thank you to all for staying a little longer. We hope that you've seen the link in the chat box for the survey to take. We really want to know your ideas. I think we are just concluding our webinar. I'd like to actually turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Victoria Kisaki from UNESCO ICBA, to give a final word and to wrap things up. Victoria?
Thank you very much, Marianne, and many thanks to all our colleagues, participants, esteemed panelists. It's been so wonderful. I think we've left out one panelist who has not said a word. Wilbert, do you have any one statement to say just before I wrap it up in 2 minutes? In terms of your observations, at least so that we balance up the panel. Anything from you? Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Obviously, social dialogue in the African context still has challenges, especially where government is not open to dialogue, even to listen to the challenges the teachers face and find possible solutions. But social dialogue is the way to go, right away from the institution, the school level, because there are issues that affect teacher effectiveness at the school level, and they run through the administrative structure. And therefore, we need to do much work to bring together, first of all, teacher unions and teacher associations, and bring the stakeholders, because if information that affects the teacher, which automatically affects the learners, is known and appreciated by all stakeholders, then we shall see a very big change in the way teachers work, in the way society appreciates the teachers' work, and how effective the teaching learning process will be, thus achieving the intended objectives in our teacher learning process. I want to thank everyone for the participation.
Thank you so much, Philbert, and all the colleagues that have been here that have volunteered their time. Allow me to start with Salusal, who gave remarks on behalf of our director here at UNESCO ICBA, Dr. Ebim Banga, who represented the AFTRA as well as the Teaching Council for Zambia. We want to thank you so much, Oliver Liang from Geneva, connecting us, sharing experiences from ILO. Thank you so much, Pedi, Anawi from Education International, and Philbert Bates Baguma from Uganda. And also to my colleagues, Marianne and Yvonne, who have been facilitating this session. We want to thank you so much. And I also want to thank everybody that has been present. You have persisted even after a few minutes. Thank you so much. You really, really value that commitment. And just maybe to sum it up, there are keywords that have been spoken. One, if you want to understand what social dialogue is all about, just know it's an exchange of information. It's about consultation. It's about negotiation. Those are the key things that have stood out. And if you're going to be successful, it needs to be institutionalized. And we need to think about sustainable interventions with the right structures to make sure that what we dialogue about yields results. Colleagues, I want to thank you so much. We promise to share with you the recording and the PowerPoint presentations. And from what I see in the chat room, it's like people are demanding for another session concerning this. Other countries are seeking for support, and we are here to support you from the KIX Africa 19 Hub. So thanks again and have a beautiful evening. Thank you, everyone. Don't forget to fill in the evaluation tool. We look forward. Yes, the panelists are turning on their cameras to say bye to everybody. Unfortunately, the participants can't. We hit about 150 plus participants. So thank you, everybody. And we really love you and appreciate you. And see you for the next webinar. We have one on 5th of September. It's on out-of-school children. Please join us as we talk about the out-of-school children and how to support them. We are sharing experiences from West Africa, and it will be on September 5th, the 5th. So we look forward to seeing you.
And then we'll be having another one on the same for teachers. Thanks, everybody, and bye-bye.